Blood and Cowboy Honor. Savannah Savvy Callahan had spent 10 years trying to forget Jesse McCade, the outlaw who disappeared without a word. But when he rode back into town, dust-covered and staring straight at her, she knew the past had finally caught up. He leaned against the saloon door, his voice a slow rasp. "Didn't think I'd come back for you, did you, darlin'?" he murmured. "Reckon we got unfinished business." Chapter 1. The ghost of yesterday rides in. The dust swirled, a miniature cyclone kicked up by the hooves of the approaching horse. Savannah Callahan, savvy to those few who dared familiarity, squinted against the midday glare, her hand instinctively going to the worn leather of the rifle sheath strapped to her saddle. 10 years. 10 years of dust and drought, of sunrise and sunset, painting the vast New Mexico sky in hues of fire and ash, and still, the sight of a lone rider approaching the Callahan ranch set her heart to pounding a rhythm of unease. She'd been barely 22 when Jesse McCade vanished, a wisp of smoke in the wind, leaving behind a void as gaping as the canyons that scarred their land. Now, at 32, she was a woman forged in the crucible of hardship, her youthful softness tempered by the relentless demands of running a ranch bordering the lawless territories. Her auburn hair, once a cascade of fiery curls, was mostly tamed in a practical braid, threaded with strands of premature silver, a testament to sleepless nights and worries etched deeper than any crow's feet. The rider drew closer, resolving from a hazy silhouette into a figure that sent a shiver of recognition and something akin to dread snaking down her spine. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. But the way he sat his horse, that easy, almost arrogant grace, the tilt of his worn Stetson, it was unmistakable. Jesse McCade. He was older, harder, the lines around his eyes etched deeper, like the ravines carved by relentless winds. His face, once boyishly handsome, was now weathered and lean, a map of hardship and secrets etched onto every plane. But those eyes, those piercing blue eyes that could see right through her, they hadn't changed. They held the same unsettling intensity, the same spark of wildness that had both terrified and captivated her a decade ago. Savvy's breath hitched. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her dreams, each scenario ending with her either shooting him on sight or collapsing into his arms. Reality offered no such clarity. She remained frozen, her hand still hovering near her rifle, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, a flicker of something she refused to acknowledge, and a bone-deep weariness that threatened to buckle her knees. The Callahan Ranch, once a sprawling testament to her father's ambition, was now a shadow of its former glory. Years of drought, rustlers, and the ever-present threat of the encroaching railroad had taken their toll. The once proud buildings were weathered, the corrals half empty. Only Savvy's stubborn will and the loyalty of a handful of aging ranch hands kept it from crumbling into dust. Jesse reined in his horse a few yards from where she sat astride her own, a sturdy Appaloosa mare named Dust Devil. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, punctuated only by the creak of saddle leather and the distant caw of a hawk circling overhead. The air itself seemed to crackle with unspoken history, with the weight of 10 years of silence. He dismounted, the movement fluid and economical, the dust settling around his worn boots like a shroud. He didn't approach, didn't offer a greeting, just stood there, leaning against the weathered hitching post in front of the abandoned saloon, her saloon, a dream she had once fostered, now as dry and desolate as the surrounding land. His gaze held hers, unwavering, unyielding. And then, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down her spine, a sound that stirred memories she'd buried deep, memories of stolen kisses under a moonlit sky, of whispered promises that tasted of dust and danger. "Didn't think I'd come back for you, did you, darlin'?" he murmured, the words laced with a hint of something that sounded like regret, but could just as easily have been mockery. "Reckon we got unfinished business." The words hung in the air, heavy and potent. Unfinished business. The understatement of a century. He'd left without a word, without a goodbye, shattering her heart and leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life that had suddenly become impossibly heavy. He'd ridden off into the sunset, chasing shadows and whispers of outlaw glory, leaving her to face the harsh realities of the frontier alone. Savvy swallowed, her throat dry. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her own eyes narrowed, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil raging within. "You have a lot of nerve, McCade. Riding in here, after all this time like you own the place." He pushed himself off the hitching post, taking a slow step toward her. The movement was deliberate, almost predatory, and Savvy felt a primal instinct to flee. But she held her ground, her back ramrod straight, her hand tightening on the reins of her horse. "I never owned anything, Savvy," he said, his voice softer now, the hard edge replaced by a weariness that mirrored her own. "Least of all you. But I did make a promise." A promise. The word echoed in the silence, a bitter reminder of all that had been lost. She remembered the night he'd left, the desperate plea in his eyes, the whispered vow that he'd return. She'd clung to that promise, foolishly, desperately, until the years had slowly eroded it, leaving behind only the bitter residue of betrayal. "Promises are easily broken, Jessie," she said, her voice laced with ice. "Especially by outlaws." He stopped, his gaze searching hers, as if looking for something he'd lost, something he desperately needed to find. "Some promises are worth keeping, Savvy. Even the ones made by a man like me." A sudden gust of wind whipped across the yard, scattering dust and tumbleweeds, a tangible manifestation of the storm brewing between them. Savvy knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that his return was not a coincidence. He was here for a reason, and that reason was tied to the secrets and shadows that clung to him like the dust on his clothes. And she, whether she liked it or not, was caught in the middle of it. The ghost of yesterday had ridden in, and it was about to change everything. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation, and the distant rumble of thunder felt a lot more than the approach of an ordinary storm. Chapter 2. Shadows lengthen on the Callahan Ranch. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the Callahan Ranch, painting the weathered buildings in hues of ochre and deep violet. The beauty was deceptive, a thin veil over the underlying tension that had settled like a shroud since Jesse McCade's arrival. Savvy watched him from the porch of the main house, his silhouette stark against the fiery sunset. He was unsaddling his horse, his movements practiced and efficient, betraying nothing of the turmoil she knew must be churning beneath his stoic exterior. She'd offered him a place in the bunkhouse, a grudging concession to the ingrained code of hospitality that even her bitterness couldn't override. He'd accepted without a word, his eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps just resignation. The ranch hands, a motley crew of aging cowboys and weathered drifters, had watched his arrival with a mixture of suspicion and wary curiosity. They knew his reputation, the whispered tales of his outlaw past, and they knew the history between him and Savvy. Inside the house, the aroma of simmering stew filled the air, a meager offering of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. Old Maggie, the Callahans' cook and housekeeper for as long as Savvy could remember, bustled around the kitchen, her wrinkled face etched with concern. Maggie had been more than a cook, she was a confidant, a surrogate mother, the one constant in Savvy's turbulent life. "He's trouble, child," Maggie had muttered earlier, her voice low and laced with warning. "Mark my words, that man brings nothing but heartache." Savvy had offered a non-committal shrug, unwilling to voice the fear that echoed Maggie's words. She knew Jesse was trouble. She'd known it 10 years ago, and she knew it now. But she also knew that she couldn't simply turn him away. There was a debt to be paid, a promise to be reckoned with, even if that promise had been broken a decade ago. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of indigo and deep purple, Jesse entered the main house, his boots thudding softly on the worn wooden floor. He'd washed up, the dust of the trail rinsed away, revealing the harsh lines of his face, the haunted look in his eyes. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a picture of reluctant humility that didn't quite fit the image of the hardened outlaw. "Maggie said supper's ready," Savvy said, her voice devoid of warmth, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns of the wood grain on the table. She refused to meet his eyes, afraid of what she might see there, afraid of the emotions he might stir within her. He nodded, taking a seat at the opposite end of the long, scarred table. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and Maggie's quiet movements in the kitchen. Savvy forced herself to eat, the stew tasteless in her mouth, her appetite lost to the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Why are you here, Jessie?" she finally asked, the question blunt and direct, her gaze finally meeting his. He looked up, his blue eyes holding hers, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "I told you," he said, his voice low. "Unfinished business." "That's not an answer," Savvy retorted, her frustration rising. "You left me, Jessie. You left me without a word, without a goodbye. You vanished into thin air. And now, 10 years later, you expect me to believe you're here because of some unfinished business?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "I know I hurt you, Savvy. And I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I need your help." The words hung in the air, surprising her. She'd expected defiance, arrogance, perhaps even a threat. But not this vulnerability. It disarmed her, throwing her off balance. "My help?" she asked, her voice softer now, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of help could an outlaw possibly need from me?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands, his fingers tracing the rim of his tin plate. "It's complicated," he said. "There are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you back then." "Try me," Savvy challenged, her voice regaining its edge. "I've learned a lot in 10 years, Jessie. I'm not the naive girl you left behind." He looked up again, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "There's a man, Silas Thorne. He's looking for something. Something he believes I took from him." The name sent a chill down Savvy's spine. Silas Thorne. She'd heard the whispers, the rumors of his ruthlessness, his cruelty. He was a shadow figure, a man who operated outside the law, a man who controlled the territories with an iron fist. "And what is it he thinks you took?" Savvy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jessie hesitated again, his gaze searching hers. "It's something that belonged to my father," he said. "Something Thorne believes is rightfully his. He sent men that—" He stopped, took another ragged breath, and continued. "That my father stole years ago, that I then protected. Now, he thinks I have it. And he'll stop at nothing to get it back." A sudden realization dawned on Savvy, a cold wave of understanding washing over her. "And you think it's here?" she said, her voice flat. "You think it's somewhere on the Callahan ranch?" He nodded, his eyes filled with a bleak resignation. "It's the only place it could be. My father, he had a connection to this land, to your father. A secret I never fully understood. But I know it's here. And Thorne knows it too." The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, the silence pressing in on them, heavy and suffocating. Savvy felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, not just at Jessie, but at her own father, at the secrets he'd kept hidden, the legacy of danger he'd left behind. She was dragged into a mess she wanted nothing to do with. She wanted to tell him to get out, walk away from her life. "So, I'm supposed to place my trust in the word of an outlaw? A man I haven't seen in 10 years, a man who broke my heart?" He looked at her with sadness. He rose from his chair, circling to face her. He bent at the knee and gently touched her hand. "I know, Savvy. I know. But you're the only one I trust." The air felt thin, charged with an unspoken plea. A plea that, despite everything, she found herself unable to ignore. The night had just begun. Chapter 3. Unspoken words, unfading scars. The dishes were cleared, Maggie's retreating footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Savvy and Jessie alone in the lingering lamplight. The silence that settled between them wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't entirely hostile either. It was a silence laden with unspoken words, with the weight of shared history and the ghosts of unfading scars. Jesse had moved to stand by the window, his silhouette framed against the vast, star-studded expanse of the New Mexico night. He stared out at the darkness, his shoulders slumped, his posture betraying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Savvy watched him, her anger slowly giving way to a grudging empathy. She couldn't deny the pull she still felt, the lingering embers of a love that had once burned so brightly. "Tell me about your father," Savvy said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. She needed to understand, to unravel the tangled threads of the past that had brought Jesse back to her doorstep. He turned, his face half-shadowed, his eyes reflecting the distant starlight. "He was a complicated man," he said, his voice low and laced with a mixture of regret and affection. "Hard, driven, haunted by things he never spoke of. He rode with the best and the worst. He made enemies, and he made mistakes." "And Silas Thorne?" Savvy prompted, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. Jesse's jaw tightened, his hand clenching into a fist. "Thorne was his partner, once. They rode together, rustled cattle, lived by their own code. But something happened, something that drove them apart. A betrayal, a theft. I never knew the full story. Only that my father ended up with something Thorne wanted, something he believed was rightfully his." "And this something it's here, on the ranch?" Savvy asked, her gaze sweeping across the room, as if searching for a hidden clue, a tangible sign of the past. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "That's what I believe. My father spent time here years ago. He knew your father. They had some kind of arrangement. I don't know the details, but I know this land holds the key." Savvy thought of her own father, a stern, taciturn man who'd built the Callahan Ranch from nothing, a man who'd guarded his secrets as fiercely as he'd guarded his land. She'd always sensed there was more to his past than he'd ever revealed, a hidden darkness that had cast a long shadow over their lives. "My father never spoke of your father," Savvy said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "He never spoke of anything that mattered." Jesse's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. They were both men of few words, Savvy. Men who carried their burdens in silence. "And now, those burdens are ours," Savvy said, a sigh escaping her lips. The weight of the past, of her father's secrets and Jesse's return, felt heavy on her shoulders. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, his scent a mixture of leather, dust, and something indefinably him stirring memories she'd tried to suppress. "I won't let Thorne hurt you, Savvy," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I promise you that." The promise, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver down her spine. It was the same promise he'd made 10 years ago, the promise he'd broken. But this time, there was a different quality to his voice, a desperation that resonated with her own fears. "I don't need your protection, Jesse," she said, her voice regaining its edge, a defense mechanism against the emotions he stirred within her. "I can take care of myself." He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know you can, darlin'. You always could. But that doesn't mean I won't try." Their gazes locked, and for a moment, the years melted away, and they were standing there, not as adversaries, not as strangers, but as two people bound by a shared past, by a love that had been lost and found, broken and perhaps, just perhaps, still capable of healing. Savvy averted her gaze and nervously toyed with a loose thread on the tablecloth. She focused on the texture, the way the fabric felt rough, unlike Jesse's calloused hand on hers. "What exactly is this item? This object Thorne is after?" she asked, switching back to the pressing issue, away from the intimacy his presence conjured. Jesse moved away from the window, back toward the table. He picked up a discarded napkin, folding and unfolding it absently. "My father never described it clearly. He always referred to it as the legacy. Said it was more than just an object, it was proof. Proof of something Thorne had done, something he wanted buried." "Proof of what?" Jesse shook his head. "I don't know. A murder? A land grab? Some deal with the railroad?" He never said. "But whatever it is, Thorn believes it could ruin him. Savvy processed this, the implications sinking in. This wasn't just about a stolen trinket, it was about power, about secrets that could topple a man like Silas Thorn. And she was caught in the middle, her ranch, her life, potentially the hiding place for something that could ignite a war. So, we're looking for something we don't even know what it looks like that could be anywhere on this vast ranch, and a ruthless outlaw is on his way to find it. Savvy summarized, a touch of bleak humor in her voice. That about sums it up, Jesse agreed, a grim smile playing on his lips. And you expect me to trust you in all of this? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. He met her gaze, his blue eyes unwavering. I don't expect it, Savvy, but I hope for it. I need your help. And I need you to believe in me. Just one more time. His tone was softer now, less an outlaw, more a man. The vulnerability she saw reflected back stripped another layer of her defenses. She knew that the smart play would be to kick him out. But the pull of his request, the quiet whisper of a shared history, was too compelling. The night ahead promised only uncertainty and danger, illuminated only by the faint glimmer of a trust she wasn't sure she could afford to give. Chapter 4. A bargain struck in the desert twilight. The decision hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable. Savvy, despite her reservations, despite the logical part of her brain screaming at her to run, found herself unable to turn Jesse away. The pull of the past, the faint flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he had changed, was too strong to resist. And there was something else, too, a sense of responsibility, a loyalty to her own father's legacy, however murky it might be. I'll help you, she said, the words a quiet declaration in the stillness of the room. But on my terms. Jesse's eyes held hers, a flicker of relief, quickly masked by a cautious reserve. Name them. They moved outside, the cool desert air a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the house. The moon, a sliver of silver in the vast, inky sky, cast long, ethereal shadows across the ranch. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft crunch of their boots on the gravel and the distant howl of a coyote. First, Savvy said, stopping near the corral, her gaze fixed on the horses shifting restlessly in the moonlight. No lies. I need to know everything, Jesse. Everything about your father, about Thorn, about what we're looking for. He nodded, his expression grim. Agreed. I'll tell you everything I know, which I admit isn't much, but it's the truth. Second, she continued, turning to face him, her voice firm, no violence. Not on my ranch. I won't have bloodshed here. If Thorn comes, we deal with him another way. This was harder for him. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, the ingrained instinct to fight, to meet force with force. But he finally nodded, a reluctant concession. I'll do my best, Savvy. But Thorn, he doesn't play by the rules. Then we'll have to make our own, Savvy said, her voice laced with steel. And third, she added, her gaze unwavering, when this is over, you leave. You go back to wherever you came from, and you leave me in peace. This was the hardest condition, the one that cut the deepest. She saw the pain flicker in his eyes, the unspoken longing that mirrored her own. But she couldn't afford to be weak, not now, not with so much at stake. He looked away, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. That's what you want? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Savvy swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. It's what's best, she said, her voice barely audible. For both of us. He finally nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. All right, Savvy, he said, his voice resigned. Those are my terms as well. Full honesty, minimum violence, and I disappear when it ends. A bargain struck, a pact sealed under the watchful gaze of the desert moon. It was a fragile alliance, built on mistrust and hope, on the ashes of a broken past and the uncertain promise of a future. Where do we start? Savvy asked, turning her attention back to the practicalities, to the daunting task that lay ahead. Jesse drew a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of the Callahan Ranch. My father used to talk about a place, a hidden canyon, He called it the Whispering Gulch. Said it was a place of secrets, a place where the wind carried the voices of the past. Whispering Gulch, Savvy repeated, the name unfamiliar, yet strangely evocative. She'd explored most of the ranch, but the land was vast, riddled with hidden canyons and forgotten trails. He said it was marked by a peculiar rock formation, Jesse continued. A twisted juniper tree growing out of a sandstone cliff, shaped like a hawk in flight. Savvy's mind raced, trying to recall any such landmark. She knew the land intimately, but the description was vague, could fit a dozen places scattered across the miles of rugged terrain. We'll start at dawn, she said, her voice decisive. We'll ride out, search for this Whispering Gulch. And we'll hope we find whatever it is we're looking for before Thorn does. Jesse nodded, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of shared determination, of a fragile understanding passing between them. The night was filled with uncertainty, with the looming threat of danger, but for the first time since his arrival, Savvy felt a glimmer of hope. It was a dangerous hope, a fragile hope, but it was enough to fuel her, to drive her forward into the unknown, with the outlaw by her side. The desert held its breath, awaiting the dawn and the whispered secrets it might reveal. The silence now was one of anticipation, rather than the heavy press of the unknown. They were partners, in a sense, facing an uncertain future together. She couldn't let herself think beyond that. Chapter 5. The Sheriff's Suspicion, a Town's Unease. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sky a vast expanse of pale blue, the air still holding the chill of the desert night. Savvy and Jesse rode into Redemption, the small, dusty town that served as the closest semblance of civilization to the Callahan Ranch. The town was a collection of weathered buildings huddled around a central square, a testament to the resilience and stubbornness of those who dared to eke out a living in this unforgiving land. They needed supplies, and Savvy needed to gauge the mood of the town, to see if any whispers of Silas Thorne had reached its isolated borders. Jesse's presence was a risk, his face likely plastered on wanted posters in more civilized parts of the territory, but Savvy had insisted. She needed him by her side, needed his knowledge of Thorne and his methods. They rode in slowly, drawing curious glances from the townsfolk. Redemption was a small community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and a stranger, especially one with Jesse's rugged appearance and the air of danger that clung to him, was an immediate object of suspicion. Savvy led the way to the general store, a weathered building with a creaking porch and a dusty window display. Inside, the store was a dim, cluttered space, filled with the scent of leather, coffee, and gunpowder. Old Man Hemlock, the store's proprietor, a wizened man with shrewd eyes and a perpetually skeptical expression, greeted them with a curt nod. "Savvy," he said, his voice raspy. "Haven't seen you in town for a while. And who's your companion?" His gaze lingered on Jesse, his eyes narrowing. "This is Jesse," Savvy said, her voice casual, trying to project an air of normalcy. "He's working for me, helping out with the ranch." Hemlock's skepticism remained, but he didn't press the issue. He knew better than to pry too deeply into the affairs of the Callahan Ranch. Savvy quickly gathered the supplies they needed: flour, beans, coffee, ammunition, her movements efficient and practiced. As they were leaving the store, Sheriff Brody, a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and a steely gaze, approached them. Brody was a lawman of the old school, tough but fair, a man who believed in justice, but also understood the nuances of frontier life. "Savvy," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Heard you had a visitor at the ranch." Savvy's heart skipped a beat. News traveled fast in Redemption, even faster when it involved an outlaw. "Just a hired hand, Sheriff," she said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his. "Helping me out with the cattle." Brody's gaze shifted to Jesse, his eyes studying him intently. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Haven't seen you around here before." Jesse met the sheriff's gaze, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. "Just passing through," he said, his voice smooth, betraying nothing of his past. helping out a friend. Brody remained unconvinced, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "I'll be keeping an eye on you," he said, his voice a low warning. "Redemption doesn't tolerate trouble." "We're not looking for trouble, Sheriff," Savvy said, stepping between them, her voice firm. "We're just trying to make a living." Brody held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, a grudging acknowledgement. "See that you do," he said, turning and walking away, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden boardwalk. Savvy let out a sigh of relief as the sheriff disappeared into the saloon. The encounter had been tense, a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Jesse's presence was a liability, a constant threat to their fragile alliance and her safety. She was not used to this feeling of vulnerability, and it was a new, unnerving companion. Outside, away from prying eyes, Savvy turned on Jesse, her voice low and urgent. "You need to be more careful," she whispered. "Brody is no fool. He suspects something." Jesse nodded, his expression grim. "I know, but I can't hide in the shadows forever, Savvy. Thorne will find me, whether I'm here or on the run." "But if Brody arrests you," Savvy began, her voice trailing off. "Then you'll have to find the legacy on your own," Jesse finished, his voice flat. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. She was walking a tightrope, balanced between the law, an outlaw, and a ruthless killer. One wrong step, one slip-up, and everything could come crashing down. She took a deep breath and reminded herself of her own strength. "We have to be smarter is all. And we have to work quickly. I don't like the eyes of this whole town on us. Makes me feel like a trapped animal." Jesse considered her words, his gaze assessing. "Agreed. The sooner we find what we're looking for, the sooner I can be out of your hair and out of danger." The unspoken words hung between them and away from you. The reminder of their bargain, of his promised departure, sent a pang of something she couldn't quite name through her. It wasn't regret, not exactly, but a sadness. A wistful ache for what might have been, for what could never be. They mounted their horses, the silence between them filled with a new layer of tension, the weight of the town's suspicion adding to the already heavy burden they carried. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, the vast, open landscape seeming to amplify their isolation, their vulnerability. The sky, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a watchful eye, observing their every move. Chapter 6. Echoes of Laughter. Whispers of Betrayal. Back at the ranch, Savvy found herself drawn to the old, abandoned homestead, a crumbling adobe structure that stood a short distance from the main house. It was where she'd grown up, where her memories of her father were strongest, where the echoes of laughter and the whispers of betrayal still lingered in the dust-filled air. She hadn't been back there in years, the pain of the past too raw, the memories too bittersweet. But now, with Jesse's return and the search for the legacy, she felt compelled to revisit those forgotten corners of her life, to seek answers in the shadows of her childhood. Jesse followed her, his presence a silent, watchful shadow. He understood, without her having to say a word, the significance of this place, the emotional weight it carried. The homestead was in ruins, the roof partially collapsed, the windows boarded up, the walls cracked and crumbling. But the structure still held a ghostly beauty, a testament to the dreams and aspirations of those who had built it, to the lives that had been lived within its walls. Savvy pushed open the creaking door, the hinges protesting with a groan. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the faded remnants of a life long gone. A broken rocking chair sat by the empty fireplace, a child's tattered doll lay abandoned in a corner, a faded tapestry hung crookedly on the wall. "This was your room," Savvy said, her voice a soft whisper, her gaze fixed on a small, dusty alcove. She remembered the countless hours she'd spent there, dreaming of a future that had never materialized, a future that had been stolen from her by Jesse's departure. Jesse stood beside her, his gaze sweeping across the room, his eyes searching for clues, for any sign of the hidden legacy. "Your father, did he ever talk about his past?" he asked, his voice low. Savvy shook her head. a bitter smile touching her lips. He was a man of secrets, Jesse. He kept his past locked away, hidden behind a wall of silence. They moved through the house, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, their hands brushing against the dusty furniture, the crumbling walls. Savvy felt a pang of sadness, of loss, not just for her father, but for the life she'd once envisioned, for the dreams that had been shattered. In what had been her father's study, a small, cramped room filled with dusty books and faded papers, Savvy found an old, leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably her father's. She sat down at the dusty desk, her heart pounding, her hands trembling as she opened the journal. The first few entries were mundane, accounts of ranch life, of cattle drives and weather patterns. But then, she found a passage that made her breath catch in her throat. Met with C. Today. Discussed the arrangement. He's nervous, but he agrees. It's the only way. The legacy must be protected. C. Could that be Jesse's father, Cole McCade? Savvy's mind raced, trying to decipher the cryptic words, to piece together the puzzle of the past. She continued reading, her eyes scanning the faded ink, her heart pounding with anticipation. The next few entries were filled with veiled references to a secret, to a hidden object, to a danger that loomed large. The gulch is the key. He says the wind whispers secrets. He placed it in the cave behind the falls. Whispering Gulch. The name echoed in her mind, confirming Jesse's story. But the details were still vague, the location still uncertain. Savvy closed the journal, her mind buzzing with questions. She looked up at Jesse, her eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I think we're getting closer, she said, her voice a hushed whisper. My father, he knew about the legacy. He helped hide it. Jesse nodded, his expression grim. But he didn't say where exactly. Just the gulch. And a cave. Savvy stood up, her gaze sweeping across the room, her eyes searching for another clue, another piece of the puzzle. And then she saw it. A small wooden box, tucked away on a high shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of dusty books. She reached for the box, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusty, easily broken. She pried it open, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, intricately carved wooden hawk, its wings outstretched, as if in flight. It was beautiful, exquisite, and Savvy knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was it. This was the legacy, or at least a part of it. And beneath the hawk, folded neatly, was a single piece of parchment. She carefully removed it. It feels wrong, she breathed, half to herself, staring at the hawk. To be unearthing all these secrets. Jesse moved closer, his shoulder brushing hers. Sometimes, Savvy, secrets need to be unearthed, to be brought into the light. She nodded slowly, knowing he was right. She unfolded the parchment. Her father's looping script stared back at her. It was not a map, as she had slightly hoped. It was a letter, addressed to her. The words seemed to leap off the page, revealing a truth far more complex and devastating than she could have ever imagined. The past, she realized, was not just whispering, it was screaming. The silence of the homestead was broken only by the frantic thudding of her heart. Chapter 7. Beneath the watchful eyes of the Mesa. The letter was a confession, a revelation, a testament to the tangled web of love, loyalty, and betrayal that had bound her father and Cole McCade together. It spoke of a forbidden love affair between her father and Jesse's mother, a secret romance that had blossomed in the harsh landscape of the frontier, a love that had been doomed from the start. My dearest Savannah, the letter began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the secrets I have kept for so long must finally be revealed. I loved a woman once, a woman who was not your mother. Her name was Sarah McCade, and she was the most beautiful, the most spirited woman I have ever known. Savvy's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she read the words, her mind struggling to reconcile this new reality with the image she'd always held of her stoic, reserved father. We met in secret, beneath the watchful eyes of the mesa, our love a fragile flower blooming in the desert. But our happiness was short-lived. Sarah was married to Cole McCade, a man who was both my friend and my rival. He was a hard man, a dangerous man, and he would never have understood our love. The letter went on to describe the events that had led to the rift between her father and Cole McCade, the theft of a valuable document, a map that detailed a hidden vein of silver on Callahan land, a map that Thorne had coveted. Cole discovered our affair. He was enraged, consumed by jealousy. He accused me of stealing the map, of betraying him. I denied it, but he didn't believe me. He swore revenge, and he took Sarah away, leaving me with nothing but a broken heart and a legacy of guilt. The legacy. The wooden hawk. It wasn't just proof of Thorne's wrongdoing, it was a symbol of a love that had been lost, a reminder of a betrayal that had spanned generations. And the map was still out there, hidden somewhere in Whispering Gulch. I hid the map, Savannah, along with a letter from Sarah, confessing her love for me and revealing Thorne's treachery. I hid them in the place Cole called Whispering Gulch, in the cave behind the falls, hoping that one day the truth would be revealed and our love would be vindicated. Savvy closed the letter, her eyes filled with tears, her heart aching for the father she had never truly known, for the love he had lost, for the burden he had carried. She looked up at Jesse, her gaze searching his, her voice a choked whisper. "Your mother, she loved my father," she said, the words a revelation, a confirmation of the tangled history that bound them together. Jesse nodded, his expression somber, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "I always suspected," he said, his voice low. "I found letters, fragments of stories, but I never knew the full truth." The wooden hawk, sitting on the dusty table, seemed to glow in the dim light, a tangible link to the past, a symbol of a love that had defied boundaries, a love that had endured despite betrayal and loss. "We need to find this map, Jesse," Savvy said, her voice regaining its strength, her determination renewed. "We need to find Whispering Gulch, and we need to expose Thorne's lies." Jesse nodded, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of shared purpose, of a bond forged in the crucible of shared history passing between them. They left the homestead, the letter and the wooden hawk carefully tucked away, the weight of the past heavy on their shoulders, but also a sense of clarity, of a path forward, illuminated by the truth. They rode out towards the distant mesas, the sun setting behind them, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, now seemed charged with a new significance, with the echoes of a love story that had unfolded beneath its watchful gaze. Savvy scanned the horizon, searching for the landmark Jesse had described, the twisted juniper tree shaped like a hawk in flight. The air was still, the silence broken only by the soft thud of their horses' hooves and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. And then she saw it, a towering sandstone cliff, rising majestically from the desert floor, and on its face, a twisted juniper tree, its branches reaching towards the sky, its silhouette unmistakably that of a hawk in flight. "Whispering Gulch," she said, her voice a breathless whisper, her heart pounding with anticipation. Jesse nodded, his eyes fixed on the cliff, his expression grim. "Let's hope the wind still whispers its secrets," he said, his voice low, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The mesa loomed before them, a silent sentinel guarding the secrets of the past and the dangers of the present. They both felt it a change, a sense that they were drawing closer, not just to the map, but to a confrontation that had been brewing for decades. The air was thick with anticipation, with the promise of revelation, and the threat of violence. Chapter 8. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Loyalty. Whispering Gulch lived up to its name. The wind, funneled through the narrow canyon, moaned and sighed, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to carry the voices of the past. The air was cooler here, shaded by the towering cliffs, the silence deeper, more profound. Savvy and Jesse dismounted, their horses tethered to a stunted juniper tree. They stood at the entrance to the canyon, their gazes sweeping across the rugged landscape, their senses alert to any sign of danger. "The cave it's behind the falls," Jesse said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the cliff face. They followed the narrow, winding path that led deeper into the canyon, the sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. The air grew damp, the vegetation more lush, a testament to the hidden spring that fed the waterfall. They rounded a bend, and there it was, a cascade of water tumbling down the cliff face, creating a shimmering curtain that obscured the entrance to a dark, gaping cave. The sight was both beautiful and ominous, a natural wonder that held both the promise of discovery and the threat of the unknown. Jesse drew his revolver, his posture tense, his eyes narrowed. "Stay close," he said, his voice a low warning. They approached the waterfall cautiously, the spray of water drenching their clothes, the roar of the falls deafening. Jesse pushed aside the curtain of water, revealing the dark, cavernous entrance to the cave. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, the silence heavy and oppressive. The only light came from the entrance, casting long, dancing shadows on the cave walls. Jesse lit a lantern, the flickering flame illuminating the rough-hewn walls, the damp floor, the stalactites hanging from the ceiling like ancient teeth. They moved deeper into the cave, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, their senses alert to any sound, any movement. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, something ancient. "There," Jesse said, his voice a hushed whisper, pointing to a small, wooden chest tucked away in a crevice in the cave wall. Savvy's heart pounded, her hands trembling as she approached the chest. It was old, weathered, the wood scarred and cracked, but it was intact. She knelt down, her fingers tracing the outline of the chest, her mind racing. This was it. The legacy. The map, the letter, the truth that had been hidden for so long. She lifted the lid, the hinges protesting with a groan. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a roll of parchment, tied with a leather thong, and a small, sealed envelope. The map. And the letter from Jesse's mother. Savvy carefully removed the map, her hands trembling as she unrolled it. It was a detailed drawing of the Callahan Ranch, meticulously rendered, with a specific area marked with a red X. The vein of silver. The source of the conflict, the object of Thorne's desire. She then picked up the letter, her heart aching for the woman who had written it, for the love she had shared with her father, for the tragedy that had befallen them. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the seal, a sense of unease washing over her. "Are you sure you want to read it?" Jesse asked, his voice soft, his eyes filled with concern. Savvy nodded, her voice a choked whisper. "I need to know," she said. "I need to know the truth." She broke the seal, her hands trembling as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, the ink faded, but the words were clear, powerful, filled with a love that had transcended time and betrayal. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began, "I write this with a heavy heart, knowing that our time together is coming to an end. Cole suspects, and I fear for our safety. He is a jealous man, a dangerous man, and he will stop at nothing to have his revenge." The letter went on to describe Sarah's love for Savvy's father, her despair at their forced separation, her fear of Cole McCade's wrath. And then, she revealed the truth about the map, about Thorne's involvement. "Cole did not steal the map, my love. It was Thorne. He forged Cole's signature. He framed him, hoping to seize control of the Callahan land. I saw him do it, Thomas. I saw him with my own eyes. This letter is my testimony, my proof of his treachery." Savvy's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in disbelief. Thorne. He was the true villain, the architect of the conflict, the one who had manipulated events, who had destroyed lives. She looked up at Jesse, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and relief. "Your father, he was innocent," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "Thorne framed him." Jesse nodded, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a burning intensity. "I knew it," he said, his voice low and laced with a cold fury. "I always knew it. The revelation changed everything. It wasn't just about protecting the Callahan Ranch, it was about clearing Cole McCade's name, about exposing Thorne's lies, about seeking justice for the wrongs that had been committed. But even as relief washed over them, the opening of the cave darkened. A silhouette filled it, blocking the faint light. A voice, cold and cruel, shattered the silence of the ancient cave.
Well, well.
Looks like I found what I was looking for. Silas Thorne. He'd found them. Chapter 9. A dance with danger. A waltz with the past. Thorne stood at the cave entrance, a menacing figure framed by the cascading waterfall. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes cold and calculating. He held a revolver in his hand, the barrel glinting in the dim light, pointed directly at Jesse. Behind him, 2 other men emerged from the shadows, flanking him like predatory wolves. They were rough-looking, hard-faced men, their hands resting on the butts of their own weapons. The odds were stacked against them, the situation desperate. "McCade," Thorne said, his voice a low growl, his gaze fixed on Jesse. "I knew I'd find you eventually. And I see you've found my property." Jesse stood his ground, his posture tense but defiant, his hand hovering near his own revolver. "It's not yours, Thorne," he said, his voice calm, betraying nothing of the fear that must have been churning inside him. "It never was. You have something that belongs to me," Thorne continued, his voice hardening. "The map. And the letter. Hand them over, and I might let you live." Savvy stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Thorne, her voice surprisingly steady. "You forged Cole McCade's signature," she said, her words clear and sharp. "You framed him. Sarah McCade's letter proves it." Thorne's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by a cruel amusement. "So, the little bird has learned to sing," he said, his voice mocking. "It doesn't matter. The letter is worthless. No one will believe it." "We'll see about that," Savvy retorted, her chin lifting defiantly. She wouldn't back down, not now, not with the truth finally revealed. Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the cave. "You're a fool, just like your father," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "He thought he could defy me, too. And look where it got him." Jesse's hand tightened on his revolver, his knuckles white. "Leave her out of this, Thorne," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." "Oh, I intend to," Thorne said, his gaze shifting back to Jesse, his eyes filled with a cold, predatory gleam. "But first, the map. And the letter. Hand them over, McCade. Or watch her die." He gestured with his revolver toward Savvy, his meaning clear. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Savvy's heart pounded, her breath caught in her throat. She knew Thorne was capable of anything, that he wouldn't hesitate to kill her. But she wouldn't show fear, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Jesse hesitated, his gaze flickering between Savvy and Thorne, his mind racing, calculating the odds. He knew he couldn't win a gunfight, not against 3 men. But he couldn't hand over the map, the letter, the proof of his father's innocence. He made a decision, a desperate gamble. "All right, Thorne," he said, his voice calm, his posture relaxing slightly. "You win. I'll give you what you want." He slowly reached into his coat, his movements deliberate, drawing Thorne's attention. Savvy watched, her heart in her throat, her mind racing, trying to anticipate his next move. As Jesse's hand emerged from his coat, it wasn't the map or the letter he held, but a small leather pouch. He tossed it at Thorne's feet, the pouch landing with a soft thud. "What's this?" Thorne asked, his voice suspicious, his eyes narrowing. "Dust," Jesse said, his voice flat.
"From the mine."
"From the Callahan land. Enough to blind you and your men for a few seconds." Before Thorne could react, Jesse drew his revolver and fired, not at Thorne, but at the lantern hanging from the cave ceiling. The lantern shattered, plunging the cave into darkness, the only light coming from the entrance, now obscured by the swirling dust. Chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out, echoing through the cave, the flashes of gunfire illuminating the scene in brief, Fleeting moments. Savvy dropped to the ground, covering her head, her heart pounding in her ears. She heard Jesse's voice, shouting above the din. "Run, Savvy. Get out of here." She scrambled to her feet, her senses disoriented, her vision obscured by the dust and darkness. She stumbled blindly through the cave, following the sound of Jesse's voice, the roar of the waterfall guiding her towards the entrance. She burst out of the cave, gasping for air, her clothes soaked, her body trembling. She looked back, seeing the figures struggling in the darkness, the flashes of gunfire illuminating the scene like a macabre dance. Jesse emerged from the cave, his face covered in dust, his clothes torn, a bloody gash on his arm. He grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the waterfall, towards the horses. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent, his breath ragged.
Now.
They mounted their horses, spurring them into a gallop, leaving behind the chaos of the cave, the echoes of gunfire, and the looming threat of Silas Thorne. They rode hard, the wind whipping through their hair, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. They had survived, for now, but the dance with danger was far from over. The waltz with the past had just begun a faster, more dangerous tempo. Chapter 10. The storm breaks, secrets unravel. They rode through the night, pushing their horses to their limits, the vast, open landscape offering little cover, the looming threat of Thorne's pursuit a constant pressure at their backs. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, a gnawing fear that settled in the pit of Savvy's stomach. They finally stopped at dawn, in a secluded arroyo, hidden from view by a cluster of cottonwood trees. The horses were lathered, their sides heaving, and Savvy and Jesse were both exhausted, their bodies aching, their minds racing. They dismounted, tending to the horses first, their movements practiced and efficient, born of years of living on the land. They watered the horses, loosened their cinches, and allowed them to graze on the sparse vegetation that grew along the creek bed. Savvy sat down heavily on a fallen log, her body trembling with exhaustion and the lingering effects of adrenaline. She looked at Jesse, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. He was tending to the gash on his arm, the wound bleeding freely, a testament to the violence of their encounter with Thorne. "We need to get you to a doctor," Savvy said, her voice laced with concern. Jesse shook his head, his jaw tight. "No time," he said, his voice raspy. "Thorne will be coming after us. We need to get to Sheriff Brody, show him the letter, the map." Savvy knew he was right, but the thought of riding back into redemption, of facing Brody's suspicion and the potential threat of Thorne's men, filled her with dread. "He won't believe us," she said, her voice laced with doubt. "He'll think we're just outlaws, trying to save our own skins." "He has to," Jesse said, his voice firm, his eyes meeting hers. "It's the only chance we have." They rested for a few hours, catching snatches of sleep, their bodies exhausted, their minds unable to fully relax. The sun rose higher in the sky, the heat intensifying, the landscape shimmering in the distance. As they prepared to ride, a distant rumble echoed through the arroyo, growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of approaching horses, many horses. Jesse's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively going to his revolver. "Thorne," he said, his voice grim. "He's found us." Savvy's heart pounded, her breath caught in her throat. They were trapped, outnumbered, with nowhere to run. They mounted their horses, drawing their weapons, their faces set, their postures tense. They rode to the edge of the arroyo, peering out at the open landscape, their eyes scanning the horizon. And then they saw them, a cloud of dust rising in the distance, growing larger with each passing moment, and beneath it, a group of riders, their figures silhouetted against the bright sky. Thorne and his men. But there was something else, too. Another group of riders, approaching from the opposite direction, their figures smaller, less distinct, but definitely there. Savvy squinted, her eyes straining to make out the details. And then she recognized them. Sheriff Brody and a posse of townsmen, riding hard, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. The two groups converged, meeting in a clash of dust and hooves, the air filled with the sounds of shouting, the crack of gunfire. Savvy and Jesse watched from the edge of the arroyo, their hearts pounding, their hopes rising. The battle was short, fierce, and decisive. Brody and his men, armed with the element of surprise and the righteous anger of a town betrayed, quickly overwhelmed Thorn's outlaws. Thorn himself, seeing his men fall, his plans unraveling, tried to flee, but Brody rode him down, tackling him from his horse, the two men wrestling in the dust. The fighting ended as quickly as it had begun, the silence settling over the landscape, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the horses. Savvy and Jesse rode out of the arroyo, approaching the scene cautiously, their weapons still drawn. Brody, his face grim, his clothes covered in dust, stood over Thorn, his revolver pointed at the outlaw's head. "It's over, Thorn," Brody said, his voice cold and hard. "You're finished." Thorn glared at him, his eyes filled with hatred and defiance, but he said nothing. Brody turned his attention to Savvy and Jesse, his gaze questioning. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Savvy dismounted, her legs shaky, her body trembling. She reached into her saddlebag, pulling out the wooden hawk, the map, and the letter. "This," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is the truth." She handed the items to Brody, her gaze meeting his, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. He took them, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the map, the letter, the wooden hawk. The wind picked up and howled across the plains, like a cry of the truth finally being unleashed. The storm had broken, and the secrets had unraveled. But the aftermath remained, a landscape of shattered trust and uncertain futures. Chapter 11. Blood on the Sand, Tears in the Rain. Brody read Sarah McCade's letter slowly, his expression changing from suspicion to disbelief, then to a grim understanding. He examined the map, his eyes tracing the lines, his mind piecing together the puzzle of the past. He looked at the wooden hawk, his fingers tracing its intricate carvings, a symbol of a love lost and a truth revealed. He finally looked up, his gaze meeting Savvy's, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and respect. I didn't know," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I believed the stories, the rumors. I thought you thought he was an outlaw," Savvy finished, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Just like everyone else." Brody nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground, his shoulders slumping. "I misjudged him," he said, his voice laced with remorse. "I misjudged you both." He turned his attention to Thorn, his eyes hardening, his voice regaining its authority. "You're under arrest, Thorn," he said, his voice cold and hard. "For murder, for forgery, for a lifetime of lies." Thorn glared at him, his face contorted with rage, but he said nothing. He knew he was beaten, his plans shattered, his empire crumbling. Brody's men secured Thorn and his remaining outlaws, their faces grim, their movements efficient. The townspeople, who had ridden with Brody, watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of relief and shame, their understanding of the past forever altered. As Thorn was being led away, he stopped, his gaze locking with Jesse's, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "This isn't over, McCade," he spat, his voice a low growl. I'll get you both." Jesse met his gaze, his expression unflinching, his voice calm and steady. "It is over, Thorn," he said. "The truth is out. You've lost." Thorn was taken away, his threats echoing in the silence, a lingering shadow of the darkness that had plagued their lives. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke, the sky opening up, unleashing a torrent of rain. It washed away the dust, the blood, the remnants of the battle, cleansing the land, washing away the sins of the past. Savvy stood in the rain, her face turned towards the sky, the water streaming down her cheeks, mingling with her tears. She felt a sense of relief, of release, a burden lifted from her shoulders. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, but the cost had been high. Jesse came to stand beside her, his presence a silent comfort, his hand gently touching her arm. He didn't say anything, He just stood there, sharing her grief, her relief, her quiet contemplation of the storm-washed landscape. He said he'd leave, Savvy said, her voice a choked whisper, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When this was over, he promised. Jessie nodded, his gaze following hers, his expression unreadable. I remember, he said, his voice low. The rain continued to fall, a steady, cleansing downpour. Savvy knew that Jessie's departure was inevitable, that it was part of their bargain, part of the price of freedom. But the thought of him leaving, of being alone again, filled her with a profound sadness, a sense of loss that went deeper than she had anticipated. She had thought she wanted him gone, to be rid of him and the constant tension. But with him by her side, for this brief time, facing down unimaginable dangers, she'd felt a life in her she'd thought long dead. He turned to her, his blue eyes, usually so guarded, now filled with a raw emotion of vulnerability that mirrored her own. Savvy, he began, his voice hesitant, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her heart aching. She didn't want him to go. She wanted him to stay, to build a life with her, to heal the wounds of the past together. But she knew it was impossible. He was an outlaw, a drifter, a man haunted by his past. She was a rancher, a woman tied to the land, to her responsibilities. Their worlds were too different, their paths too divergent. Don't, she said, her voice a choked whisper, pulling away from his touch, her eyes opening, meeting his.
Don't say anything.
Just go. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own, a longing that echoed in her heart. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, his jaw tight, his expression resolute. He turned and walked towards his horse, his movement slow, his shoulders slumped. He mounted, his gaze fixed on the horizon, not looking back. Savvy watched him ride away, the rain blurring her vision, the tears streaming down her cheeks. He disappeared into the storm, a solitary figure fading into the distance, leaving her alone once again, with the rain washing away the blood on the sand and the tears that fell like a monsoon. The landscape, though cleansed by the storm, felt emptier than ever. She wasn't sure how she would rebuild, how she would move on, but she knew she had to. She was a Callahan, and Callahans didn't break. They endured. Chapter 12. The Outlaw's Code, a Lover's Dilemma. Savvy returned to the ranch, the silence of the house deafening after the chaos of the past few days. The rain had stopped, the sun setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beauty that felt hollow, empty, without Jessie there to share it. Maggie greeted her with a warm embrace, her wrinkled face etched with concern. "Child, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice filled with worry. Savvy managed a weak smile, her heart heavy with sadness. "I have, Maggie," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "I have." She told Maggie everything, about the letter, the map, the confrontation with Thorn, and Jessie's departure. Maggie listened in silence, her eyes filled with understanding, her hand gently stroking Savvy's hair. "He's gone, then," Maggie said, her voice soft, when Savvy had finished her story. Savvy nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "He promised he would," she said, her voice breaking. "He kept his word." Maggie sighed, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "That man, he had a code," she said, her voice laced with a grudging respect. "An outlaw's code, perhaps, but a code nonetheless." Savvy knew what she meant. Jessie had lived by his own rules, outside the law, but he had a sense of honor, a loyalty, a commitment to the truth that had surprised her. He had risked his life to help her, to clear his father's name, to expose Thorn's lies. He had kept his promises, even the one that broke her heart. The next few days were a blur of activity. Sheriff Brody returned to the ranch, bringing with him the recovered map and Sarah McCade's letter, now officially recognized as evidence of Thorn's crimes. The news spread quickly through Redemption, the town buzzing with the revelations, the whispers of the past finally brought to light. The townsfolk, who had once looked at Savvy with suspicion, now greeted her with a newfound respect, their apologies awkward but sincere. They had misjudged her, misjudged Jessie, and they were eager to make amends. Savvy accepted their apologies, her heart still heavy, her mind still filled with thoughts of Jessie. She tried to focus on the ranch, on the work that needed to be done, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt empty, hollow, the silence of the house a constant reminder of his absence. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching the sunset, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, a familiar figure silhouetted against the fiery sky. Savvy's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be. He was gone. He had promised. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized the familiar way he sat his horse, the tilt of his worn Stetson, the easy grace of his movements. It was Jessie. He rode up to the porch, dismounting slowly, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and something else. Something that made her heart pound with a renewed hope. "You came back," she said, her voice a breathless whisper, her eyes searching his. He nodded, his expression grim, his voice low. "I try to leave, Savvy," he said. "I rode for days, trying to put distance between us, trying to keep my promise." "But," Savvy prompted, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't," he said, his voice laced with a raw emotion. "I couldn't stay away. Thorne's words, they haunted me. He's in jail, but his threat, I couldn't leave you unprotected." Savvy's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and something more. Something that felt like the fragile beginnings of a new hope. "Thorne's men are scattered," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "Sheriff Brody has assured me that the threat is over." "Maybe," Jessie said, his voice unconvinced. "But I couldn't take that chance. I had to come back. To make sure you were safe." He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them, his scent leather, dust, and something indefinably him stirring the familiar ache in her heart. "And there's something else," he said, his voice softer now, his eyes searching hers. "Something I realized while I was riding away. Something I should have said a long time ago." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands, his fingers clenching into fists. I love you, Savvy," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "I always have. I always will." The words hung in the air, heavy and potent, a declaration that shattered the silence, a promise that transcended the past, the pain, the outlaw's code. Savvy's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with a joy she had thought lost forever. She reached out, her hand touching his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his weathered face. She had spent so long guarding her heart, convinced that love was weakness. But his returned presence, his honesty, stripped all of her defenses away. "I love you, too, Jessie," she said, her voice a breathless whisper, her heart soaring. "I always have." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if afraid to let her go. They stood there, embraced in the fading light, the silence of the ranch no longer empty, but filled with the promise of a new beginning, a love reborn, a future unwritten, but filled with a hope that burned brighter than the setting sun. The outlaw had returned, not just to protect her, but to claim her, to finally break free from the shackles of his past and embrace a future he had never dared to dream of. The dilemma remained, could an outlaw and a rancher ever truly find a shared horizon? But for now, in this embrace, the answer seemed to be a resounding, hopeful yes. Chapter 13. A midnight ride. A desperate plea. The days that followed were a tentative dance, a slow rebuilding of trust, a careful exploration of the fragile love that had blossomed between them. Jessie stayed at the ranch, working alongside Savvy, his presence a constant comfort, a source of strength and a reminder of the future they were building together. He was still an outlaw in the eyes of the law, but Sheriff Brody, knowing the truth about Thorne and Cole McCade, had turned a blind eye, allowing Jessie a measure of freedom, a chance to prove himself. The townspeople, too, had accepted him, their initial suspicion replaced by a grudging respect, a recognition of his courage and his loyalty to Savvy. But the shadow of Thorne's threat still lingered, a dark cloud on the horizon. He was in jail, awaiting trial, but his words "I'll get you both" echoed in Jesse's mind, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked. One night, a frantic pounding on the door shattered the quiet of the ranch. Savvy and Jesse, startled awake, exchanged a look of alarm. Jesse grabbed his revolver, his instincts honed by years of living on the edge. Savvy opened the door cautiously, revealing a young boy, breathless and terrified, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and tears. It was Billy, one of the younger ranch hands, a boy who had always looked up to Jesse with a mixture of awe and admiration. "Miss Savvy Jesse," he gasped, his voice choked with sobs. They took him, Thorne's men, they broke him out of jail." Savvy's heart plunged.
Thorne.
He had escaped. The threat was real, and it was closer than they had imagined.
How?
Jesse asked, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowed. "I don't know," Billy sobbed. They overpowered the guards, killed Sheriff Brody." The words hit Savvy like a physical blow. Sheriff Brody, dead. The man who had believed in them, who had helped them, now gone. Another victim of Thorne's ruthlessness. "Where did they go?" Jesse asked, his voice urgent. Towards the old silver mine," Billy stammered. "The one on your land, the one Thorne wanted, the silver mine. The map. The legacy." It all came crashing down on Savvy. The realization that Thorne's escape was not just about revenge, it was about reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. "He's going to destroy the evidence," Savvy said, her voice a choked whisper. "The map, the letter, everything." Jesse nodded, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a cold determination. "We have to stop him," he said, his voice low and laced with steel. They saddled their horses quickly, their movements efficient and practiced, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Billy, despite his fear, insisted on riding with them, his loyalty to Jesse and Savvy unwavering. They rode through the night, the moon their only guide, the darkness amplifying the danger, the urgency of their mission. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, now seemed menacing, filled with hidden threats, with the echoes of Thorne's violence. They reached the silver mine as dawn was breaking, the sky streaked with hues of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the darkness that lay ahead. The mine was an abandoned relic of the past, a gaping hole in the side of the mountain, a testament to the greed and ambition that had driven men to seek their fortunes in this unforgiving land. They dismounted, their horses tethered a short distance from the mine entrance, their senses alert to any sound, any movement. Jesse drew his revolver, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay close," he said, his voice a low warning to Savvy and Billy. They entered the mine cautiously, the darkness enveloping them, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The only light came from the entrance, casting long, dancing shadows on the mine walls. They moved deeper into the mine, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They heard voices, muffled and indistinct, coming from further down the tunnel.
Thorne.
And his men. Jesse signaled for Savvy and Billy to stay back, his hand raised in a gesture of caution. He crept forward, his movements silent, his body pressed against the cold, damp wall of the mine. He peered around a corner, his eyes narrowing, his breath catching in his throat. Thorne was there, standing in a small chamber, surrounded by his men. He held a torch in one hand, illuminating the scene, and in the other, he held the map and Sarah McCade's letter. "Burn them," Thorne ordered, his voice cold and harsh. "Burn everything. Leave no trace." One of his men stepped forward, taking the map and the letter, preparing to toss them into a small fire that burned in the center of the chamber. Jesse knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let Thorne destroy the evidence, the proof of his father's innocence, the legacy of their love. He knew that if he hesitated, all would be lost. But he also knew that rushing Thorne and his men would lead to all their certain deaths. He stepped out into the chamber, his revolver raised, his voice ringing out in the darkness. "It's over, Thorne," he shouted. "Drop your weapons." The scene was a tableau of desperation, of a past catching up with the present, of a love that refused to be silenced. Savvy, watching from the shadows, felt a surge of fear, but also a fierce determination. She wouldn't let Thorn win. She wouldn't let him destroy everything they had fought for. The mine, a symbol of greed and ambition, was about to become the stage for a final, desperate showdown. The plea was not just to Thorn, but to fate itself, a plea for justice, for redemption, for a future free from the shadows of the past. Chapter 14. The heart remembers what the mind forgets. Thorn whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing with a cold fury. His men, startled by Jesse's sudden appearance, raised their weapons, their faces grim, their postures tense. "McCade," Thorn spat, his voice laced with venom. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" "It's not about quitting, Thorn," Jesse said, his voice calm and steady, his revolver unwavering. "It's about justice. It's about the truth." "The truth?" Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the mine. "The truth is what I say it is. And I say you're a dead man." He gestured to his men, signaling them to attack. But before they could move, Savvy stepped out of the shadows, her rifle raised, her voice ringing out in the darkness. "Drop your weapons, Thorn," she shouted, "or I'll shoot." Her voice was firm, her aim steady, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. She wouldn't let Thorn hurt Jesse, not again. She wouldn't let him destroy the evidence, the legacy of her father's love. Thorn hesitated, his gaze flickering between Savvy and Jesse, his mind calculating the odds. He was outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in the depths of the mine. "You wouldn't shoot," Thorn sneered, his voice laced with a false bravado. "You're a woman. You don't have the stomach for it." Savvy's finger tightened on the trigger, her eyes unwavering. "Try me," she said, her voice cold and hard. The standoff stretched, tense and brittle, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the ragged breathing of the men. Billy, standing behind Savvy, his young face pale but resolute, held a small pistol, his hand trembling but his aim true. Thorn's men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between their leader and the two figures who stood against them, their courage faltering in the face of such unwavering determination. Thorn finally lowered his weapon, his shoulders slumping, his face contorted with rage and defeat. "All right, McCade," he said, his voice a low growl. "You win.
For now."
His men followed suit, dropping their weapons reluctantly, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resentment. Jesse stepped forward, his revolver still trained on Thorn, his movements cautious. "The map," he said, his voice sharp. "The letter. Hand them over." Thorn hesitated, his eyes flickering towards the fire, a flicker of defiance in his gaze. But he knew he had no choice. He slowly reached into his coat, pulling out the map and the letter, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. He tossed them at Jesse's feet, the documents landing with a soft thud on the damp floor of the mine. "It's over, Thorn," Jesse said, his voice firm. "You're finished." As Jesse bent to retrieve the documents, Thorn saw his opportunity. With a sudden, desperate move, he lunged for a discarded pickaxe, swinging it wildly at Jesse's head. Savvy screamed, her rifle firing, the shot echoing through the mine. But the bullet went wide, striking the wall, missing Thorn by inches. Jesse, caught off guard, stumbled back, the pickaxe grazing his shoulder, tearing his flesh. He cried out in pain, dropping his revolver, his hand clutching at his wounded arm. Thorn raised the pickaxe again, his eyes filled with a murderous rage, ready to deliver the final blow. But before he could strike, a shot rang out, this time from Billy's small pistol. The bullet struck Thorn in the leg, sending him crashing to the ground, his face contorted with pain, the pickaxe clattering harmlessly on the floor of the mine. The mine was silent once more, the echoes of the gunshots fading, the tension slowly dissipating. Jesse, his arm bleeding, leaned against the wall, his face pale, his breath ragged. Savvy rushed to his side, her eyes filled with concern, her hands gently tending to his wound. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Are you all right?" He nodded, managing a weak smile, his eyes meeting hers. "I'll live," he said, his voice raspy. "Thanks to you and Billy." They looked at Billy, the young boy standing tall, his small pistol still smoking, his face a mixture of shock and pride. He had saved Jesse's life. He had proven his courage. He had stood up to the darkness and emerged victorious. He lowered the gun with shaking hands, and Savvy moved to embrace him. "You were very brave," she told him, her voice raw with emotion. Thorn lay on the ground, groaning in pain, his leg bleeding profusely, his face a mask of defeat and despair. The mine, once a symbol of his greed and ambition, had become his prison, his tomb. The heart remembers what the mind forgets. The love between Savvy's father and Jesse's mother, the truth of Cole McCade's innocence, the legacy of the Callahan Ranch, all of it had been buried, hidden in the darkness, but it had endured, waiting to be revealed, waiting to be reclaimed. And now, in the depths of the mine, amidst the chaos and violence, the heart had spoken, the truth had emerged, and the past had finally been laid to rest. But the future, though brighter, was still uncertain. They had won this battle, but the scars of the past, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. The mine, silent once more, held its breath, as if waiting to see what new stories would unfold in the light of the dawn that was now fully breaking, spilling into the entrance, chasing away the lingering shadows. Chapter 15. Trapped between two worlds, bound by one love. With Thorn defeated and the evidence secured, Savvy, Jesse, and Billy emerged from the mine, blinking in the bright sunlight, the fresh air a welcome contrast to the stifling darkness they had left behind. The ordeal had left them battered and bruised, but their spirits remained unbroken, their resolve strengthened by the victory they had won. They returned to Redemption, where Sheriff Brody's deputy, a young, inexperienced man named Johnson, had taken charge, struggling to maintain order in the wake of the jailbreak and the sheriff's death. He was overwhelmed, uncertain, and deeply relieved to see Savvy and Jesse return, the captured Thorn and his men a testament to their courage and their commitment to justice. The townspeople, shocked by the news of Brody's death and Thorn's escape, greeted them with a mixture of fear and relief. They had witnessed the violence, the chaos, the near collapse of their fragile community, and they were eager for a return to normalcy, to peace. Thorn was imprisoned once again, this time under heavy guard, his threats echoing hollowly in the confines of his cell. His men, their spirits broken, their loyalty shattered, offered no resistance, their fate sealed by their association with a man whose ambition had led them to ruin. The map and Sarah McCade's letter were presented as evidence, clearing Cole McCade's name, exposing Thorn's crimes, and revealing the truth about the Callahan Ranch's hidden wealth. The town, once divided by suspicion and mistrust, was united in its condemnation of Thorn, in its recognition of the injustice that had been done. But for Savvy and Jesse, the victory felt bittersweet. They had won the battle, but the war had taken its toll. Brody's death, Jesse's injuries, the lingering threat of Thorn's vengeance, all cast a long shadow over their triumph. And there was another issue, another dilemma that loomed large in their minds: Jesse's status as an outlaw. He had helped them, he had proven his loyalty, he had risked his life to protect Savvy and the town, but he was still a wanted man, his past a constant burden, a barrier to the future they both desired. They found themselves trapped between two worlds, the world of the law, of order, of societal expectations, and the world of the outlaw, of freedom, of living by one's own code, of defying the constraints of a society that had often proven unjust and unforgiving. They were bound by one love, a love that had blossomed in the harsh landscape of the frontier, a love that had endured betrayal, loss, and violence, a love that had been tested and proven true. But could that love survive the challenges that lay ahead? Could they find a way to bridge the gap between their two worlds, to create a future where they could be together, free from the shadows of the past? Savvy, standing on the porch of her ranch house, watching Jesse tend to his injured horse, felt the weight of the dilemma, the uncertainty of their future. She loved him. She trusted him. She wanted to build a life with him, but she knew that the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and obstacles. She joined him and gently touched his arm. He turned to her, his blue eyes filled with an old love that had been recently reborn, but also with a concern that mirrored her own. "What will happen now?" she asked, her voice low, her gaze searching his. Jesse sighed, his shoulders slumping, his expression grim. "I don't know, Savvy," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "I'm still an outlaw. I have a price on my head." "But you helped us," Savvy argued, her voice rising in frustration. "You saved the town. You proved your innocence, your father's innocence." "It doesn't matter," Jesse said, his voice flat. "The law doesn't care about intentions. It only cares about facts. And the fact is, I broke the law." Savvy knew he was right, but she refused to accept it. She wouldn't let him go, not again. She wouldn't let the past, the law, the expectations of society, dictate their future. "There has to be a way," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll find a way. We'll fight for it." Jesse looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and admiration, but also with a weariness, a resignation that broke her heart. "I'm tired of fighting, Savvy," he said, his voice low and laced with pain. "I'm tired of running. I want a life. With you." The words, spoken with such raw emotion, such vulnerability, pierced Savvy's heart. She understood his exhaustion, his longing for peace, his desire for a normal life, a life with her. She reached out, her hand cupping his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his weathered face. "We'll have that life, Jesse," she said, her voice a soft whisper, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I promise you, we'll find a way." The promise hung in the air, heavy and potent, a beacon of hope in the midst of uncertainty, a testament to the power of their love, a vow to overcome the obstacles that lay ahead. They were trapped between two worlds, but they were bound by one love, and that love, they believed, would be their guide, their strength, their salvation. The future remained unwritten, but they would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, determined to forge a path to a life where they could finally be free. Chapter 16. The sins of the father, the hope of the daughter. The solution, as it often did, came from an unexpected source. Old Maggie, who had witnessed the unfolding drama with a mixture of concern and quiet wisdom, revealed a secret she had kept hidden for years, a secret that had the potential to change everything. "There's someone you need to talk to, child," she said to Savvy one evening, as they sat together in the kitchen, the aroma of simmering stew filling the air. "Someone who knew your father, knew Cole McCade, knew the truth about what happened all those years ago." "Who?" Savvy asked, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Judge Thompson," Maggie said, her voice low, her eyes fixed on Savvy's. "He's retired now, living in Santa Fe. But he was the circuit judge back then, the one who presided over the cases in these parts. He knew more than he ever let on." Savvy's mind raced. Judge Thompson. She remembered him vaguely, a stern, imposing figure who had occasionally visited the ranch when she was a child. She had always sensed there was more to him than his judicial demeanor, a hidden depth, a knowledge that went beyond the confines of the law. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Savvy asked, her voice laced with frustration. Maggie sighed, her wrinkled face etched with regret. "I promised your father I wouldn't," she said. "He was afraid of what might happen if the truth came out. He wanted to protect you."
"But now?"
Savvy prompted. "Now things are different," Maggie said, her voice firm. "Thorne is in jail. The truth about Cole McCade is known. It's time. It's time for you to seek justice, for Jesse, for yourself." Savvy knew she was right. It was time to confront the past, to seek the truth, to find a way to clear Jesse's name, to secure their future. She and Jesse rode to Santa Fe, leaving Billy in charge of the ranch, his young shoulders now carrying the weight of responsibility with a newfound maturity. The journey was long and arduous, but their determination never wavered, their hope fueled by Maggie's revelation, by the possibility of a new beginning. They found Judge Thompson living in a modest adobe house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, a quiet, unassuming residence that belied the power he had once wielded, the secrets he had kept. He was an old man now, his hair white, his body frail, but his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence, the same penetrating gaze that Savvy remembered from her childhood. He greeted them with a mixture of surprise and curiosity, his gaze lingering on Jessie, his mind clearly recalling the past, the connection to Cole McCade. Savvy explained their situation, telling him everything about Thorn, about the map, about Sarah McCade's letter, about Jessie's outlaw status, and their desire for a future together. Judge Thompson listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on Savvy and Jessie, his mind weighing the evidence, assessing their sincerity, their determination. When Savvy had finished her story, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping across the room, as if searching for answers in the shadows of the past. "I knew," he finally said, his voice low and laced with regret. "I knew Cole McCade was innocent. I knew Thorn was lying. But I didn't have enough evidence. I couldn't prove it." Savvy's heart sank. She had hoped for a revelation, a solution, but the judge's words seemed to offer only confirmation of the injustice they had faced. But the judge continued, his voice gaining strength, his eyes meeting Savvy's. "There is something I can do. Something I should have done a long time ago." He reached into a drawer, pulling out a faded, leather-bound book, its pages filled with his meticulous handwriting. It was his personal journal, a record of his thoughts, his observations, his doubts about the cases he had presided over. "I kept a record," he said, his voice low, "of my suspicions, of the evidence that was never presented, of the witnesses who were never called. I knew, in my heart, that justice had not been served. But I was afraid. Afraid of Thorn, afraid of the power he wielded." He opened up the journal, pointing with a trembling finger to one specific section. Savvy and Jessie leaned in to read. "This changes things," Jessie said, his eyes widening. The judge nodded. "It's not official evidence," he admitted, "but it's enough. Enough for a good lawyer to argue for a pardon. A pardon for Jessie McCade. A pardon." The word echoed in Savvy's mind, a beacon of hope, a promise of freedom, a chance for a new beginning. "You would do that?" Savvy asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You would help us?" Judge Thompson smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that lit up his weathered face. "It's the least I can do," he said, his voice soft. "To atone for the sins of the past, to offer hope to the future. The sins of the father, the hope of the daughter." The words resonated with Savvy, a reminder of the legacy she had inherited, the burden she had carried, the love that had guided her. She had sought justice, not just for Jessie, but for her father, for Cole McCade, for all those who had suffered under Thorn's tyranny. And now, with the help of an old man, a faded journal, and a secret kept hidden for years, she had found it. The path ahead was still uncertain, but it was a path filled with hope, with the promise of a future where she and Jessie could finally be free, where the sins of the father would no longer cast a shadow over the hope of the daughter. She reached across and gently touched the old man's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, and he nodded, his eyes filled with a peace he likely hadn't felt in decades. Chapter 17. A showdown at dusk, a reckoning at dawn. The journey back to redemption was filled with a cautious optimism, a sense of hope tempered by the knowledge that the fight was not yet over. Judge Thompson's journal was a powerful weapon, but it was not a guarantee of success. They still needed to find a lawyer, to navigate the complexities of the legal system, to convince the authorities to grant Jessie a pardon. As they rode into town, they were met with a scene of chaos and fear. Buildings were damaged, windows were shattered, and the townsfolk huddled in their homes, their faces pale, their eyes filled with terror. "What happened?" Savvy asked, her heart pounding with dread, her gaze sweeping across the ravaged town. A young boy, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and tears, ran up to them, his voice trembling with fear. "Thorn," he gasped. He came back, "He's got men, they're holding the town hostage." "Thorn? He had escaped again. Somehow, despite being imprisoned under heavy guard, he had managed to break free, to gather his remaining loyalists, to return to redemption, seeking revenge, seeking to reclaim his power. Savi's blood ran cold. She had hoped, she had prayed, that the nightmare was over, that Thorn was defeated, that they could finally move on. But he was back, more ruthless, more desperate, more determined than ever to destroy everything they had fought for. "Where is he?" Jesse asked, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively going to his revolver. "The saloon," the boy sobbed. He's got hostages, he's demanding you, Jesse, he wants to finish this, the saloon." Savi's saloon. The place she had dreamed of, the place that had become a symbol of her hopes, her aspirations, now a stage for Thorn's final, desperate act of defiance. Jesse's jaw tightened, his eyes filled with a cold determination. "He wants a showdown," he said, his voice low and laced with steel. "He'll get one." Savi's heart pounded with fear, but she knew she couldn't let him face Thorn alone. She had stood by him through everything. She had fought alongside him. She had shared his pain, his hope, his love. She wouldn't abandon him now. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his. Jesse hesitated, his gaze searching hers, his mind clearly torn between his desire to protect her and his need for her support. "It's too dangerous, Savi," he said, his voice laced with concern. "I don't care," Savi retorted, her voice unwavering. "We face this together. We always have." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and admiration. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But stay close. And be careful." They rode towards the saloon, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the deserted streets. The town was silent, empty, the only sound the creaking of the saloon doors, the muffled voices coming from within. They dismounted, their horses tethered a short distance from the entrance, their senses alert to any sound, any movement. Jesse drew his revolver, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low whisper, his gaze meeting Savi's. She nodded, her heart pounding, her hand resting on the rifle strapped to her saddle. "Ready," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. They approached the saloon cautiously, pushing open the creaking doors, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos and fear. Thorn stood behind the bar, his face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. He held a revolver in one hand, and with the other, he gripped the arm of a young woman, a terrified hostage, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Several of Thorn's men, armed with rifles and pistols, stood around the room, their faces grim, their postures tense. The townsfolk who had been taken hostage huddled in a corner, their expressions a mixture of fear and despair. "McCade," Thorn spat, his voice a low growl, his gaze fixed on Jesse. "You came. I knew you would. Let the hostages go, Thorn," Jesse said, his voice calm and steady, his revolver unwavering. "This is between you and me." "Oh, I intend to," Thorn said, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. "But first, we have some unfinished business." He raised his revolver, pointing it at Jesse's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's over, Thorn," Jesse said, his voice firm. "You've lost. Drop your weapon." Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the saloon. "You're a fool, McCade," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "You think you can defeat me? You think you can escape your past?" "I'm not afraid of you, Thorn," Jesse said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm not afraid of my past. I'm ready to face it. Are you?" The showdown at dusk, the reckoning at dawn. The two men stood face to face, their eyes locked, their wills clashing, the fate of the town, the future of their love, hanging in the balance. The saloon, once a symbol of hope, had become a crucible, a testing ground for courage, for loyalty, for the enduring power of love in the face of hatred and violence. And Savi, standing beside Jessie, her rifle raised, her heart pounding, knew that this was the final confrontation, the ultimate test, the moment that would determine whether they would live or die, whether they would be free or forever bound by the shadows of the past. It was a gamble, a desperate play, but she had faith in Jessie, in herself, and in the love that had brought them this far. The air crackled with tension, with the promise of violence, with the silent plea for a resolution that would finally bring peace to their lives. Chapter 18. The Unforgiving Land, the Unyielding Heart. Before Thorn could pull the trigger, before Jessie could react, a voice rang out from the back of the saloon, a voice filled with authority and a surprising strength. "Drop the gun, Thorn." It was Deputy Johnson, the young, inexperienced lawman who had been left in charge of redemption. He stood in the doorway, his own revolver drawn and aimed steadily at Thorn's back. He had slipped out earlier unnoticed and circled around. Thorn hesitated, his eyes flickering towards the new threat, his mind racing, calculating the odds. He was caught between two guns, trapped in his own desperate game. "You?" Thorn sneered, his voice laced with disbelief. "You think you can stop me, boy?" "I'm not alone," Johnson said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. And then, from the shadows, other figures emerged, townsfolk, armed with rifles, pistols, whatever weapons they could find. They had overcome their fear. They had rallied together. They had decided to stand up to Thorn, to fight for their town, for their freedom. Thorn's men, seeing themselves surrounded, outnumbered, their courage faltered, their loyalty to their leader crumbling in the face of such overwhelming opposition. Thorn himself, his face contorted with rage and despair, realized that he was defeated. His plans had failed, his power had crumbled, his reign of terror had come to an end. He slowly lowered his revolver, his shoulders slumping, his eyes filled with a defeated resignation. "It's over, Thorn," Jessie said, his voice low and laced with a quiet triumph. "You're finished." Johnson stepped forward, his revolver still trained on Thorn, his movements cautious. "You're under arrest, Thorn," he said, his voice firm. "For murder, for kidnapping, for a lifetime of crimes." Thorn offered no resistance, his spirit broken, his body weary, his eyes devoid of the fire that had once burned so brightly. He was taken away, his men disarmed and imprisoned, the hostages released, the town slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. The unforgiving land, the unyielding heart. Savvy had endured hardship, loss, betrayal, and violence, but she had never given up. She had fought for her ranch, for her love, for her future, and she had emerged victorious, her spirit unbroken, her heart unyielding. She and Jessie stood together in the center of the saloon, the townsfolk surrounding them, their faces filled with gratitude, with respect, with a newfound hope. They had faced the darkness, they had confronted the past, and they had emerged into the light, their love stronger, their bond unbreakable. But there was still one final hurdle to overcome, one final obstacle to their happiness, Jesse's outlaw status. He was a free man for now, but he was still a wanted man, his past a constant threat, a barrier to the future they both desired. As they stood there, amidst the cheers and congratulations of the townsfolk, a figure emerged from the crowd, a familiar figure, his presence unexpected, his arrival a sign of hope. It was Judge Thompson, his aged face etched with concern, but his eyes filled with a determined resolve. He had followed them, he had witnessed the events, he had seen the courage of Jessie and Savvy, the resilience of the town, the final defeat of Thorn. He approached them, his hand outstretched, holding a piece of paper, an official document, its seal gleaming in the dim light of the saloon. "Jesse McCade," he said, his voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent saloon. "I have here a pardon, a full and unconditional pardon, signed by the governor himself." A gasp went through the crowd, a collective sigh of relief, a wave of joy washing over the assembled townsfolk. Jesse's eyes widened in disbelief, his heart pounding, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at Savvy, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and elation, his hand reaching out to take hers. Savi's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with happiness, her smile radiant, her grip on Jesse's hand tightening. Judge Thompson handed the pardon to Jesse, his hand clasping his shoulder, his eyes filled with a warmth, a respect, a recognition of the man he had become. "You're a free man, Jesse," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Free to live your life, free to love, free to build a future." Jesse took the pardon, his hand trembling, his eyes scanning the document, the words blurring through his tears. He was free, truly free. The past was behind him, the shadows had lifted, the future stretched before him, bright and filled with promise. He looked at Savi, his eyes filled with a love that had endured hardship, that had overcome adversity, that had emerged stronger, truer, more profound than ever before. "We did it," he said, his voice a choked whisper, his smile wide and bright. "We're free." Savi nodded, her tears flowing freely, her heart soaring, her love for him overflowing. "We're free," she repeated, her voice filled with joy, with relief, with a love that knew no bounds. The unforgiving land had tested them, had tried to break them, but the unyielding heart had prevailed, had found its strength, its resilience, its enduring power to love, to hope, to build a future together, free from the shadows of the past. They embraced. Chapter 19. Scars of the Past, Promises of the Future. The pardon was a turning point, a new beginning, a chance to build a life free from the shadows of the past. Jesse and Savi, together with the resilient townsfolk of Redemption, began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding, of healing, of forging a future filled with hope and promise. The saloon, once a symbol of Savi's dreams and Thorne's tyranny, was restored to its former glory, becoming a gathering place for the community, a testament to their resilience, their unity, their determination to overcome adversity. Jesse, no longer an outlaw, but a respected member of the community, worked alongside Savi, managing the ranch, his skills as a horseman, and his knowledge of the land proving invaluable. He was a changed man, his past still a part of him, but no longer defining him, his heart filled with a love for Savi, a commitment to their future, a desire to build a life worthy of the second chance he had been given. The scars of the past remained, both physical and emotional. Jesse's arm, wounded by Thorne's pickaxe, healed slowly, leaving a permanent reminder of the violence he had endured. Savi's heart, broken by his earlier departure and the years of hardship, gradually mended, filled with a love that was stronger, deeper, more resilient than ever before. They often spoke of the past, of their fathers, of Sarah McCade, of the secrets that had shaped their lives. They visited Whispering Gulch, the place where their parents' love had blossomed, the place where the truth had been hidden, the place where their own journey had taken a dramatic turn. They stood beneath the twisted juniper tree, shaped like a hawk in flight, a symbol of their enduring love, a reminder of the legacy they had inherited, a testament to the power of truth and redemption. They honored the memory of Sheriff Brody, erecting a memorial in the town square, a tribute to his courage, his integrity, his sacrifice. Deputy Johnson, now the Sheriff of Redemption, carried on Brody's legacy, striving to maintain law and order, to protect the community, to uphold the values that Brody had embodied. Billy, the young ranch hand who had played a crucial role in Thorne's defeat, became like a son to Savi and Jesse, his loyalty unwavering, his admiration for them boundless. He learned from Jesse, honing his skills as a horseman, absorbing his knowledge of the land, his quiet strength, his unwavering commitment to justice. One evening, as Savi and Jesse sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, a familiar beauty that now held a deeper meaning, a profound sense of peace, Jesse spoke of the future, of their plans, of the life they were building together. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, "about expanding the ranch, about breeding horses, about building a legacy of our own." Savi smiled, her heart filled with happiness, her eyes meeting his. I like the sound of that, she said, her voice soft. A legacy of love, of hope, of resilience. He reached out, his hand taking hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, a symbol of their unbreakable bond, their shared journey, their enduring love. And, he continued, his voice hesitant, his eyes searching hers, I've been thinking about children. About starting a family, about filling this house with laughter, with life, with the echoes of a new generation. Savi's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with a joy she had never dared to dream of. She leaned in, her head resting on his shoulder, her body pressed against his, her love for him a tangible presence, a force that bound them together, that transcended the past, that illuminated the future. I would love that, Jessie, she said, her voice a choked whisper, her heart soaring. More than anything. They sat there in silence, embraced in the fading light, the vast, open landscape stretching before them, a symbol of the endless possibilities, the boundless opportunities that lay ahead. The scars of the past were still there, reminders of the hardships they had endured, but they were also symbols of their strength, their resilience, their ability to overcome adversity. The promises of the future were whispered on the wind, carried on the scent of the desert sage, reflected in the shimmering stars that began to appear in the darkening sky. They were promises of love, of family, of a life built on trust, on respect, on a shared commitment to building a legacy that would endure for generations to come. They knew that there would be challenges ahead. Life was not easy. The frontier never surrendered without a fight. But together, they had the strength to face the darkness, to hold firm to love, and to make a better life. It had been a long, winding, dangerous road, with betrayals and loss woven into the fabric. But here, on this porch, in this moment, Savi had never been happier or more sure that all had been worth it. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons, the growth of the ranch, and the blossoming of Savi and Jessie's family. Their home, once filled with the echoes of loneliness and the whispers of the past, was now alive with the laughter of children, the warmth of love, and the steady rhythm of a life built on trust and mutual respect. Their eldest, a daughter named Sarah, after Jessie's mother, possessed her grandmother's fiery spirit and her father's unwavering courage. Their son, Thomas, named for Savi's father, inherited his grandfather's quiet strength and his mother's deep connection to the land. And the youngest, little Maggie, named for the woman who had been a constant source of support and wisdom, was the embodiment of joy, her laughter echoing through the ranch house, a constant reminder of the blessings they had received. The ranch prospered, expanding beyond Savi's initial dreams, becoming a symbol of resilience, of hope, of the enduring power of love to overcome adversity. Jessie, once an outlaw, was now a respected rancher, a pillar of the community, his past forgiven, his future bright, his heart filled with a gratitude for the second chance he had been given. Redemption, too, had thrived, growing from a dusty frontier town to a bustling center of commerce, its streets lined with thriving businesses, its people united by a shared history, a common purpose, a determination to build a better future. Sheriff Johnson, guided by the memory of Sheriff Brody and inspired by the example of Savi and Jessie, maintained law and order, ensuring the safety and prosperity of the community. But the past, though buried, was never truly forgotten. The scars remained, reminders of the hardships they had endured, the battles they had fought, the love that had sustained them. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of fire and ash, Savi and Jessie would speak of those days, of the challenges they had faced, of the people they had lost, of the lessons they had learned. One such evening, as the sky blazed with a particularly vibrant sunset, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, a figure silhouetted against the fiery sky, stirring memories of a past that had once seemed inescapable. Savi's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She reached for Jessie's hand, her fingers intertwining with his, her grip tightening with a familiar fear. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper, her eyes fixed on the approaching rider. Jesse squinted, his gaze narrowing, his hand instinctively going to the revolver he still wore, a habit ingrained by years of living on the edge. "I don't know," he said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But I don't like it." As the rider drew closer, they recognized the familiar figure, the way he sat his horse, the tilt of his hat, the easy grace of his movements. It was Billy, now a grown man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes filled with a maturity that belied his years. He had left the ranch several years earlier, seeking his own fortune, his own path, but he had always remained close to Savvy and Jesse, his loyalty unwavering, his gratitude for their love and support a constant presence in his life. He rode up to the porch, dismounting slowly, his gaze meeting theirs, his expression somber. "What is it, Billy?" Savvy asked, her voice laced with concern, her heart pounding with a premonition of trouble. "It's Thorn," Billy said, his voice low, his eyes filled with a grim determination. He's dying. In prison. He asked to see you, Jesse. He wants to talk." Savvy's blood ran cold.
Thorn.
The man who had haunted their lives, the man who had tried to destroy everything they held dear, now on his deathbed, seeking a final confrontation, a final reckoning. Jesse's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening, his hand instinctively tightening on his revolver.
What does he want?
He asked, his voice sharp. "I don't know," Billy said, his voice laced with uncertainty. He said he had something to tell you. Something important." Savvy looked at Jesse, her eyes searching his, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and apprehension. She knew that this was a test, a final challenge, a confrontation that could reopen old wounds, that could shatter the peace they had so carefully built. "You don't have to go, Jesse," she said, her voice soft, her hand gently touching his arm. "You don't owe him anything." Jesse hesitated, his gaze flickering between Savvy and Billy, his mind clearly torn between his desire to avoid any further contact with Thorn and a sense of obligation, a need to finally close the chapter on their shared past. "I have to," he said, his voice firm, his eyes meeting Savvy's. "I have to hear what he has to say. I have to finish this." Savvy nodded, her heart aching for him, but understanding his need for closure, his desire to finally put the ghosts of the past to rest. "We'll go together," she said, her voice unwavering, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We face this together. We always have." They rode to the prison, a grim, forbidding structure that stood on the outskirts of redemption, a stark reminder of the darkness that still lurked in the shadows of their world. They were escorted to Thorn's cell, a small, cramped space, its walls bare, its air thick with the scent of sickness and despair. Thorn lay on a cot, his body emaciated, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He looked at Jesse, a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a faint, twisted smile on his lips. "McCade," he rasped, his voice weak and hoarse. "You came. I knew you would. What do you want, Thorn?" Jesse asked, his voice cold and hard, his eyes unwavering. Thorn coughed, a hacking, painful sound that racked his body. He gestured weakly towards a small, wooden box that sat on a table beside his cot. "In there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The truth, the whole truth." Jesse hesitated, his gaze flickering between Thorn and the box, his mind filled with suspicion, with a deep-seated distrust of the man who had caused them so much pain. "Open it, Jesse," Savvy said, her voice soft, her hand gently touching his arm. "Let's hear what he has to say." Jesse nodded, his hand reaching for the box, his fingers trembling slightly. He opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, its edges yellowed with age. It was a letter, written in Thorn's own hand, a confession, a final testament to his crimes, a desperate attempt at redemption. He read the letter aloud, his voice trembling with emotion, the words painting a picture of greed, betrayal, and a lifetime of regret. Thorn confessed to everything. to forging Cole McCade's signature, to framing him for the theft of the map, to murdering Sarah McCade's brother, framing Cole, to manipulating events, to destroying lives, to pursuing a relentless vendetta against Jesse and Savvy. But there was something else, too. Something unexpected, something that brought a flicker of surprise to Jesse's eyes, a gasp of shock to Savvy's lips. Thorn confessed that he had a son, a child he had abandoned, a child he had never acknowledged, a child who had grown up without a father, without a name, without a legacy. And that child was Billy. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and potent, a final twist in the tangled web of their shared past, a final secret revealed in the face of death. Billy stood silent. Tears ran down his face, and he turned away from the group. Jesse looked at Billy, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and compassion, his heart aching for the young man who had been so loyal, so devoted, so unaware of the truth about his own parentage. Savvy reached out, her hand gently touching Billy's arm, her eyes filled with sympathy, with understanding, with a love that transcended the boundaries of blood. Thorn closed his eyes, his body relaxing, his breathing slowing, his final confession a release, a burden lifted, a desperate attempt to find peace in the face of his impending death. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The past had been revealed, the truth had been spoken, the secrets had been laid bare. The scars remained, but they were no longer wounds, but symbols of resilience, of survival, of the enduring power of love to overcome even the darkest of shadows. Jesse, Savvy, and Billy left the prison, walking together into the dawn, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of hope, of promise, of a new beginning. They had faced their demons, they had confronted their past, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, more united than ever before. The horizons stretched before them, vast and limitless, filled with the promise of a future built on love, on trust, on the enduring legacy of a family forged in the crucible of the unforgiving land. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and the unwavering spirit of those who dared to build a life on the unforgiving frontier. The Callahan Ranch became a haven, a place where family and friends gathered, where laughter echoed through the halls, and where the stories of the past were shared, not with bitterness or regret, but with a sense of gratitude for the lessons learned, the challenges overcome, and the love that had sustained them. Billy, finally knowing the truth of his parentage, struggled to reconcile the image of Thorn, the ruthless outlaw, with the father he had never known. He grappled with feelings of anger, betrayal, and a lingering sense of loss, but with the support of Savvy and Jesse, he gradually came to terms with his past, finding solace in the love of his newfound family, in the acceptance of the community, and in the legacy of the Callahan Ranch, a legacy he was now a part of. He chose to remain Billy Callahan. Jesse and Savvy raised their children with a deep appreciation for the land, for the values of honesty, integrity, and compassion, and for the importance of family and community. They taught them the stories of their ancestors, of Cole and Sarah McCade, of Thomas Callahan, of Sheriff Brody, of the struggles and triumphs that had shaped their lives, instilling in them a sense of pride in their heritage, a commitment to justice, and a deep and abiding love for the land that had sustained them. The wooden hawk, a symbol of a love lost and a truth revealed, became a cherished family heirloom, passed down through generations, a reminder of the past, a testament to the present, and a promise for the future. It sat on the mantelpiece in the main room of the ranch house, a constant presence, a silent witness to the unfolding drama of their lives. Redemption prospered, becoming a thriving town, its citizens united by a shared history, a common purpose, and a deep respect for the law and for the values of community and cooperation. Sheriff Johnson, guided by the memory of his predecessor and inspired by the example of Savvy and Jesse, maintained peace and order, ensuring the safety and prosperity of all who lived there. As the years turned into decades, Savvy and Jesse grew old together, their love deepening, their bond strengthening, their lives intertwined like the roots of the ancient juniper tree that stood sentinel over Whispering Gulch. They watched their children grow, marry, and have children of their own, their family expanding, their legacy extending, their love echoing through the generations. And on quiet evenings, as they sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, a familiar beauty that now held a deeper meaning, a profound sense of peace, they would reminisce about the past, about the challenges they had faced, the battles they had won, the love that had sustained them. They would remember the ghost of yesterday that had ridden in, the shadows that had lengthened on the Callahan ranch, the unspoken words and unfading scars, the bargain struck in the desert twilight, the sheriff's suspicion, the echoes of laughter and whispers of betrayal, the price of freedom and the cost of loyalty, the dance with danger and the waltz with the past, the storm that had broken and the secrets that had unraveled. They would remember the blood on the sand and the tears in the rain, the outlaw's code and the lover's dilemma, the midnight ride and the desperate plea, the heart that remembered what the mind forgot, the trap between two worlds and the bond of one love, the sins of the father and the hope of the daughter, the showdown at dusk and the reckoning at dawn, the unforgiving land and the unyielding heart, the scars of the past and the promises of the future, and the final confrontation of heart's sand. Horizons. And they would know, with a certainty that transcended time and circumstance, that their love had endured, that their lives had been well lived, and that their legacy would continue, carried on the wind, whispered in the canyons, etched in the hearts of those who came after them. The vast, open landscape, once a symbol of hardship and uncertainty, was now a testament to their enduring love, a canvas upon which their story was written, a legacy that would last forever. They smiled, held hands, and watched the sun set, feeling at peace. The end.